Thanks for tuning in. My name is Elle Lower. I work with Michigan Sea Grant, and I wish I was able to attend this conference in person rather than giving a pre-recorded talk, but I hope everything is running smoothly and that this session generates some good conversation for everybody attending in person. So before we get started, here's a bit of background on me. I'm based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, where I work with GLANCES, the Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System. GLANCES is a database designed to be a sort of one-stop shop for scientific information about the nearly 200 aquatic species that have been introduced to the Great Lakes region. As the GLANCES team's communication specialist, this means I spend a lot of time talking about, writing about, and posting online about invasive species. Now, before the pandemic hit, a major part of my job involved going to outreach events and talking to students, teachers, and interested community members about invasive species all over the Midwest. For example, here's a photo from Sulak's Engineers Day up in northern Michigan from a couple of years back. The conversations you have while doing public outreach are always a bit of a wild card, and I started to notice that the language my colleagues and I were using to describe invasive species could get a little bit heated and honestly more than a little loaded. The way we were describing our fight to protect the Great Lakes could get kind of dark to begin with, but at one point a stakeholder I was talking to cracked a joke that wasn't really a joke about killing off invaders to make the Great Lakes great again. Yeah, it was at that point I realized we needed to do some reading and reflecting on the messages we were sending out about invasive species and how to be sure they weren't undercutting our goals of inclusive science communication. So let's talk about the rhetoric of invasion. Before we start picking apart the specific language and metaphors we use in invasion biology, we should talk about why metaphors are important in science communication to begin with. First, metaphors are an essential part of how we talk about and conduct scientific research. We use analogies to develop hypotheses and interpret experimental results, and use metaphors to communicate our findings with other people. Even the most fundamental scientific concepts, the cell, the food chain, or agents of infectious disease, are actually based in figurative language, so there's really no sidestepping metaphor. While the careful use of metaphor can reveal new insight into natural phenomena and help explain complex research, the careless use of metaphor can cause errors in scientific reasoning, lead to public misunderstandings, and even inadvertently reinforce stereotypes in messages that undermine inclusiveness in the field. In this presentation, I'll analyze a few of the more common rhetorical frameworks in invasion biology and the respective strengths and weaknesses, present some less common alternatives, and talk about how my team and I are reflecting on the metaphors and general rhetoric that we use in our own work. So let's start with military metaphors, which are among the most common in invasion biology. In fact, invasion itself is a military term. This language can be really compelling, which is why it's so frequently used. So here's a classic example. This image shows a military recruitment poster with Uncle Sam on it, and reads, "I want you for the war on Kark." From the historical resonance of everybody doing their bit World War II style to fight off an army of invaders, to calling for support for our troops, in this case, the environmental managers who are responsible for stopping the spread of invasive species, you'll find that military language is deeply enmeshed in invasion biology. It can also be politically advantageous and help gather bipartisan support for funding species management and control efforts. It's also kind of fun. If you've ever gone out to remove a bunch of invasive plants, for instance, like I just did in my yard the other week, it feels gratifying to imagine yourself in a good versus evil struggle to save native species from the invaders threatening to destroy their habitat. Unfortunately, there are a number of issues with leaning heavily on military metaphors. First of all, this framing of good versus evil in war assigns a moral value and decision-making ability to creatures that didn't really have a choice in the matter and are just doing what they can to survive in a new habitat. Second, a war requires two opposing sides, but we as humans are actually deeply entangled with invasive species. Our patterns of global trade and travel are directly responsible for introducing species into new habitats. They didn't just wander over here unassisted. Invasive species can cause harmful effects on the environment and economy, but it's not out of deliberate malice. Leaning into military metaphors tends to let us humans off the hook for the consequences of our actions on the environment. Heavy use of military metaphors can actually damage the morale of environmental scientists and managers too. If you're in a war and you're not winning, well, you're losing. This is the exact sentiment expressed in a number of studies where biologists were interviewed about the perceptions of the invasive species management work they were doing. Rangers in Australia managing noxious weeds framed their success or failure in oppositional terms for the plants, where the presence of certain weeds meant that they were losing or that they failed. This framework ultimately led to higher rates of job dissatisfaction and burnout, which is understandable if you feel like you're going to work every day to fight a battle that you simply can't win. Next, let's take a look at nativism, another commonly used rhetorical framework. It positions non-indigenous species as an implicit existential threat to the native ones, stirring up instincts to protect our home from destructive outsiders. This table highlights a whole series of nativist rhetoric and headlines article titles over the years. We've got a couple of classic excerpts here. Alien invasion, they're green, they're mean, they may be taking over a park or preserve near you. Biological invaders sweep in, stemming the tide of invasive species, and Congress threatens wild immigrants. And my personal favorite, invasive species, pathogens of globalization. Yikes. This framework is sort of a lightning rod. It certainly attracts attention and generates discussion when it's used in science communication, but it's not necessarily positive at all. Nativist metaphors can come across as xenophobic at best, or even outright racist. There's a long, ugly history, particularly in North America, of conflating human immigrants with biological invasions. This table here draws parallels between invasive species control actions and immigration regulation through the early 20th century. In particular, it parallels the California State Quarantine of 1881 and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which followed a year later. The California Fruit Pest Law and the beginnings of Ellis Island restrictions, the Lacey Act and Plant Quarantine Act at the turn of the century, and then national quotas in the Immigration Act of the 1920s. Set side by side like this, these regulations paint a pretty unflattering picture. In practice, this nativist rhetoric can actually do way more harm than good. People who might otherwise be in support of protecting their local ecosystems from invasive species may instead start to identify with these species if the language used is too harsh. Even when your intentions are good, it's easy to see how nativist rhetoric can backfire. If we're going to critique commonly used metaphors or try to avoid using them, it's really important to have alternatives. So recently, I've been researching some alternate models for the ways people talk about and relate to invasive species in management. Writing by Indigenous scholars and other keepers of traditional ecological knowledge presents some very different rhetorical frameworks for talking about invasive species. The team behind the Great Lakes-based Tribal Climate Adaptation Menu uses the deliberately non-stigmatized term non-local beings rather than invaders to describe species that aren't originally from North America, which you can learn more about on the website. Very cool read, definitely check it out. Indigenous elders in Western Australia use a term with similar meaning when talking about introduced species in their communities, as pointed out in a great 2017 paper by Bach and Marston. This concept of non-local beings disentangles a species' origin from its behavior in the environment. Just because a species is non-local in these frameworks doesn't imply that it's necessarily harmful. Instead, the Aboriginal elders interviewed for this study described the behavior of environmental weeds as cheeky, a term applied to fast-spreading and nuisance plants. This term actually includes both native and introduced species, and it doesn't mean that they're hated, just that there's a need for people to keep an eye on them in case they grow out of control and start causing problems for their surrounding environment. It's interesting to apply this framework to Great Lakes species and makes for a valuable thought exercise if you ask me. How many species might we reconceptualize as cheeky, and how might that change our management strategies? In this paper, along with a number of others, there's also a health-based framework that might be a useful model for conceptualizing the ecological impacts of invasive species too. Thinking about invasive species as an injury that impairs the resilience of an ecosystem, an infection needing medical care, or even a chronic health condition that may never be cured but can be managed effectively for better quality of life, are all rich metaphorical frameworks that science communicators could build from and explore. So this year, my team is launching a new educator hub on Glances to help K-12 teachers meet their curricular goals for greater literacy. If you're interested in that, reach out to my colleague Joris van Zeekbroek. He will tell you so much about it. We're very excited. Anyway, we plan to work with teachers and help build lesson plans and activities on invasive species, and the thoughtful use of language is an important part of that. One of the metaphors we're experimenting with is referring to invasive species as ecological bullies. This works well with kids in particular, but adults seem to respond to this metaphor positively too. After all, nobody likes a bully. What I appreciate in particular is that describing invasive species as bullies focuses on their harmful behaviors in the ecological community, not on their point of origin. Everyone can agree that a red swamp crayfish, as seen here, which kicks other creatures out of their home, eats all their food, and causes stress or physical harm to other species, might be hard to live with. Putting the emphasis on the aggressive behavior of introduced species also helps listeners build empathy for native species and can serve as part of a call to action to help protect your neighbors from these ecological bullies. We know that this bullying metaphor isn't perfect, but it does present a more reasonable alternative to the more common rhetoric about evil foreign species taking over our home, which is especially important with content directed at kids. One thing I've learned from the teachers in my life is that calling out bullying whenever possible is really necessary in the classroom. But speaking negatively about subjects that students can turn around and apply to their classmates, like national origin or immigration status, for instance, can actually cause harassment to increase. And that is the opposite of what we want to be bringing to the classroom. This process of workshopping language use is ongoing, and it's generating a lot of good conversation with both the science teachers we talk with and internally with our own team, pushing us to think of new and different metaphors to use rather than just defaulting to old standbys. It's a refreshing challenge for us all. I'd like to close with another metaphor you might be familiar with. If the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. At the end of the day, the more metaphors we have in our rhetorical toolkit, the better we can tailor our messages to different audiences. Maybe we don't always have to frame our work in terms of waging war or fighting foreigners. Choosing to talk about preventing ecological bullying, restoring ecosystem health, and even learning to work with or around cheeky introduced species that may be here to stay can give our fellow scientists and the general public more nuanced ways to discuss the important work that we do. After all, invasion biology is a constantly evolving field. Maybe it's time that the language we use to describe it evolves too. Thanks for listening.